Hey everyone, I've noticed that many of you are enjoying the videos, but most of you haven't subscribed yet. We're super close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and your support could help us reach that milestone. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really makes a huge difference and helps us keep creating more awesome content. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. I can't pinpoint exactly when it started. Maybe it was the late night meetings or the sudden interest in fitness classes she'd never cared for before. The clues were there, tiny discrepancies in an otherwise ordinary life, but I'd brush them aside until the night she slipped. We were at dinner, just a regular Tuesday evening in our kitchen. She looked distracted, poking at her food. "You should have seen the view from the Hyatt," she said absent-mindedly, referring to a new hotel downtown. My fork paused midway to my mouth. The Hyatt? She'd told me she was working late at the office that night. I remembered because I'd ordered takeout and spent the evening by myself, thinking about how distant she'd seemed lately. "The Hyatt?" I repeated, my voice deliberately even. "Hmm?" She blinked, like she just realized I was sitting there. "Oh yeah, did I say Hyatt?" I meant, I meant the new offices on Wilshire. "Sorry, I'm a little out of it tonight." She laughed it off, but her eyes darted to the side, avoiding mine. I forced myself to smile. "Long day?" "You have no idea," she sighed, shaking her head as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. It was almost convincing. Almost. But I wasn't buying it. That single slip-up, that one innocent mistake, was all it took to change everything. It planted a seed of doubt that grew like a weed, winding its way through every interaction, every word she spoke, every look she gave me. And I couldn't stop it, couldn't ignore it. I started to notice other things after that. Her phone, which she used to leave lying around the house, was now glued to her side. If it wasn't in her pocket, it was face down on the counter. She'd glance at it, then quickly shove it away when I walked into the room. Sometimes I'd catch her smiling at a text, then slipping it back into her purse without a word. And her laughter, it was different, forced, like she was trying too hard to seem normal. I'd ask her about her day, and she'd launch into long-winded explanations that felt like rehearsed speeches, her eyes flicking to mine, gauging my reaction. Was she testing me, seeing if I'd notice? Each little discrepancy chipped away at my sanity, leaving me obsessed with the puzzle pieces that didn't fit. I needed answers, but I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. I needed proof, and that meant paying attention to the smallest details, noticing every subtle shift in her behavior. One evening, as we sat in front of the TV, I casually asked, "So what's going on at work? You've been spending a lot of time with Mark lately." She glanced at me sharply, then shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "Just a big project. You know how it is." Mark, her boss. A smooth-talking executive who always seemed to hover too close, his hand lingering on her back just a second too long during office parties. I'd never liked him, but until now I hadn't had a reason to distrust her. To distrust us, I bit my tongue and nodded. "Yeah, makes sense." "He's lucky to have you on his team." Her smile was tight. "Yeah, I guess." I watched her as she turned back to the TV, her shoulders stiff. She was hiding something, something big. I could feel it. It was in the way she avoided my gaze, the way she'd pull away when I tried to touch her, like my very presence made her uncomfortable. I decided to test a theory. The next day I left work early, parked a block away from her office, and waited. Hours dragged by, each minute a slow, agonizing tick on the clock. I thought about leaving a dozen times, convincing myself I was being paranoid. Then I saw them, Sarah and Mark, walking out of the building together, their heads close, laughing. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. She hadn't mentioned Mark was in the office that late. "Just another late-night meeting," she'd said. My stomach churned as I watched them walk to his car. She climbed into the passenger seat, and he drove off. I didn't follow them. I didn't need to. The image was seared into my brain. That night, I lay in bed beside her up bar, staring at the ceiling while she pretended to sleep. The scent of her shampoo, once comforting, now felt suffocating. I could almost hear the laughter she'd shared with him echoing in my ears. It took every ounce of self-control not to roll over and confront her, demand an explanation. But what would that achieve? She'd deny it, spin some story that would leave me feeling like a fool. I needed more than a hunch. I needed something undeniable. I began cataloging her movements. Nothing overt, just quiet observations. Each time she smiled at her phone, I noted the time. Each unexplained absence went into a mental file I'd created for her. It didn't take long before I noticed patterns. Patterns that confirmed my worst fears. By the third week, I had enough to piece together the general shape of her deception. Dinner with friends that didn't exist, lunches that ran too long, phone calls she stepped outside to take. I started intercepting the phone bills, noting numbers she called and texted frequently. One number stood out, Mark's. A chill ran down my spine as I scrolled through the list of calls, each one a nail in the coffin of our marriage. I wasn't losing my grip on reality. This was real, tangible. And it was tearing me apart. I debated confronting her, demanding answers, but something stopped me every time. There was a sick fascination in watching it unfold, in knowing more than she realized. I felt like a stranger in my own life, observing a twisted drama play out in front of me. But the pain was mine, sharp and relentless. The world around me seemed to shift, the familiar turning alien. Conversations with friends and colleagues took on a surreal quality. Were they looking at me differently? Did they know? The sympathetic smiles, the way they hesitated before mentioning Sarah, had they always been there, or was I just noticing now? My paranoia bled into every interaction. I'd ask about her at work, feigning casual interest. The responses were guarded, eyes darting away. She's been busy, they'd say, lots of late nights with Mark. The way they said his name, was there pity in their voices? Contempt? I couldn't tell anymore. By now I was living in a state of constant vigilance, scrutinizing every word, every gesture. I started searching through her things when she wasn't home. Emails, receipts, anything that might give me more concrete proof. Every piece of evidence I found made me feel both validated and sickened. It was no longer just suspicion. It was fact. Cold, hard fact. She was cheating on me. The realization hit like a sledgehammer, knocking the breath out of me. I stood in the middle of our bedroom, clutching the printouts of her messages with Mark, my vision blurring with rage and grief. My heart hammered in my chest, and I wanted to scream, to break something. But I didn't. I took a deep breath, then another, shoving the fury down into a deep, dark place. This wasn't the time to lose control. I needed to be smart about this. Sarah and Mark thought they could make a fool out of me, that I'd never figure it out. They were wrong. I folded the printouts carefully and put them back in the drawer. I knew what I had to do now. The doubt, the confusion, they were gone. In their place was a cold, steely resolve. They wouldn't see it coming. Sarah's laughter filled the kitchen, bouncing off the walls like a mocking echo of what our life used to be. I leaned against the doorframe, pretending to scroll through my phone. She stood by the sink, a glass of wine in one hand, phone in the other, giggling softly at something on the screen. The sound grated on my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. "What's so funny?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She glanced up, startled, then quickly turned off the screen and placed the phone face down on the counter. "Oh, nothing, just a silly meme from one of the girls at work." I nodded slowly. "The same girls you've been having all those late-night meetings with?" She shot me a look, her smile strained. "Yes, Ethan, the same girls." I let it go. There was no point in pushing now. Every interaction was becoming a test, a chance to catch her in another lie. But she'd grown adept at deflecting my questions, feeding me just enough plausible deniability to make me question myself. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that each response was rehearsed. Every smile a carefully crafted mask. The distance between us had widened into a chasm. At night, she'd lie beside me, close but unreachable, her body radiating a coldness I couldn't thaw. I'd stare at her back, wondering if she was dreaming of him, of Mark. I knew it was him. I just needed confirmation, something undeniable. I distanced myself from friends, family, even my colleagues. They sensed something was off, but I brushed off their concern with tight smiles and vague reassurances. I didn't need their pity. I needed answers. Conversations became brief and awkward, the unspoken tension hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. I could see the questions in their eyes. What's going on with Ethan? But no one dared to ask directly. The only person who didn't pull back was my best friend, Mike. He called me one evening, his voice tinged with genuine worry. "Hey man, haven't seen you around lately. Everything okay?" I hesitated, the urge to confide in him warring with the need to keep my suspicions hidden. "Yeah, just been busy. Work, you know." "Uh-huh," he said slowly. "It's more than that though, isn't it? Look, if you need to talk." "I'm fine," I cut him off too sharply. Regret flared, but I couldn't backtrack now. "Just dealing with some stuff. I'll catch up with you soon." "All right, just don't shut me out, okay?" I promised I wouldn't, but that promise was as hollow as the trust between Sarah and me. The truth was, I couldn't talk to anyone about what I was going through. They'd see me as weak, as a victim, and I refused to be either. The more I observed, the clearer the picture became. I started looking through Sarah's emails, her phone logs, even her work schedule. I needed every scrap of evidence to piece together the reality she'd been hiding. It was a dark, relentless obsession, but I couldn't stop. Each night when she fell asleep beside me, I'd slip out of bed and log into her accounts, scrolling through months of conversations and receipts, looking for patterns, connections. I found them. A lunch at a restaurant she'd never mentioned, a weekend work trip to a conference that didn't exist, hotel charges she hadn't accounted for, and always the same name threaded through it all, Mark. My chest tightened with every discovery, anger, betrayal, disbelief. They tangled together in a suffocating knot. But I held it in, swallowing the emotions down, letting them simmer beneath the surface. I couldn't afford to lose control now. One afternoon, I took a personal day from work and drove to her office building. I parked a few blocks away, the windows rolled down as I waited. I watched as employees filtered out, one by one. Then I saw her, Sarah, with Mark by her side. They were talking animatedly, her hand brushing against his arm as they laughed together. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat. I followed them at a distance as they walked to a nearby cafe. I stayed in my car, eyes locked on them through the tinted windshield. They sat outside, their heads close, his hand covering hers. My fingers itched to grab my phone and take a picture, but I resisted. I didn't need this confrontation to be sloppy or rushed. I needed concrete proof, something she couldn't wriggle out of. The following week, I tracked her movements more closely. I took days off under the pretense of working from home, ensuring I was free to follow her. Each time, the same pattern emerged: late lunches with Mark, evening meetings that stretched on longer than necessary. I tailed them to a downtown hotel one night, parking in the shadows as I watched them enter the lobby together. They didn't leave until the early hours of the morning. I clenched the steering wheel, knuckles turning white as I waited in the darkened car. The neon lights of the hotel sign blinked mockingly at me, a testament to my humiliation. They were so brazen, so confident that I'd never catch on. The next day, I hacked into Sarah's cloud account. It was easier than I thought it would be. She hadn't even bothered to change her passwords. And there it was, a hidden folder labeled innocuously on his work stuff. I clicked on it, pulse hammering in my ears. Photos, messages, videos. Each file another dagger to my heart. I scrolled through them mechanically, my brain struggling to process what my eyes were seeing. Pictures of them together in various hotel rooms, her head resting on his shoulder, his hand tangled in her hair. Texts filled with inside jokes, flirtations, confessions. It was all there, laid out in brutal detail. The affair had been going on for over a year, longer than I'd even suspected. My mouth went dry, fingers trembling over the keyboard. The emotions hit me all at once, a hurricane of pain, rage, and disbelief. My world narrowed to that screen, every image and word twisting the knife deeper. I couldn't stop staring at one message dated from a few months back. I can't wait until we don't have to hide anymore. I'm so tired of pretending. I just want us. Sarah's response was a mirror of that sentiment. Soon, I promise, just a little longer, and we'll figure it out. Figure it out? Figure it out? I bit back a scream, my vision blurring as hot tears pulled in my eyes. The betrayal was like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. I'd been nothing but a placeholder, a convenience to her while she plotted our marriage's end behind my back. A cold, detached clarity settled over me. I wiped my eyes, took a deep breath, and closed the laptop. The pain would be dealt with later. For now, I had a new goal: revenge. Not the petty, screaming match kind. No, this would be something far more devastating, something that would leave a mark. I spent the next few days compiling every piece of evidence, creating a meticulous dossier. I printed out emails, photos, financial records. I made copies of everything and hid them in multiple locations, ensuring I'd have access no matter what happened. Each new document, each incriminating image, was like a brick in the wall I was building around myself, keeping me focused, keeping the emotions at bay. I started distancing myself from Sarah in subtle ways, feigning disinterest, offering vague responses to her questions. She barely noticed, too wrapped up in her fantasy with Mark. Our conversations were stilted, each word carrying the weight of unspoken accusations. I wondered if she sensed it, the way I watched her now, not with love or concern, but with the calculated detachment of a hunter observing his prey. Then came the confirmation I'd been waiting for. One night, while she was in the shower, I unlocked her phone and accessed her calendar. There it was, a weekend marked off with the initials M&M. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. It was the final piece of the puzzle. I decided to confront her, not directly, but through action. I forwarded everything to my personal email, then deleted the traces from her device. She'd never know what hit her. The plan was forming in my mind, each step carefully laid out. I'd take my time, strike when they least expected. I spent hours poring over Mark's social media, his financial records, even digging into his company's history. It wasn't long before I found the skeletons in his closet, questionable transactions, discrepancies in reports. He was hiding something, and I would use it to bring him down. The moment of truth would be at the company gala, where they planned to flaunt their relationship under the guise of professionalism. I'd make sure it became the night that shattered everything for them. For Sarah and Mark, it would be a night of celebration. For me, it would be the night I dismantled their lives piece by piece. The anger and grief that had once threatened to consume me were now fuel, driving me toward a singular goal. I'd see them burn, and I'd do it with a smile. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed someone who had just as much reason to see Mark fall as I did, a partner who would be equally invested in the downfall. And there was only one person who fit that description: Claire, Mark's wife. It wasn't hard to find her contact information. A quick search through Mark's social media profiles and a few rounds of discreet messages later, I had her email. I knew I had to tread carefully, so I crafted my message with precision. Every word weighed for impact. Subject: it's time you knew the truth. Claire, I know about Sarah and Mark. You deserve to know too. If you're willing to talk, I have proof that will confirm everything. I don't want this to be messy, but I think we can both benefit from a conversation. I hesitated before hitting send, but only for a moment. My finger pressed down decisively, and the message was gone. Now, all I could do was wait. I didn't expect an immediate response, but the next morning, there it was. When and where? We met at a small, out-of-the-way cafe on the edge of the city. I'd chosen it for its anonymity, no chance of running into anyone we knew. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting in a corner booth, her back to the wall. Claire was exactly as I remembered, poised, elegant, with an icy composure that didn't crack even as I approached. "Ethan," she greeted me curtly, her voice low. "Let's skip the pleasantries. Show me what you've got." No preamble, no hesitation. I like that. I handed her the manila folder I prepared, watching her expression as she sifted through the photos, emails, and receipts. Her fingers tightened around each page, knuckles whitening as she flipped through the damning evidence. The silence stretched on, thick and tense. When she finally looked up, her eyes were hard. Bastard, she muttered under her breath, more to herself than to me. Then she took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. What's your plan? That was the opening I needed. I laid out everything I'd gathered on Mark, his secret accounts, the tax discrepancies, the suspicious transfers that all pointed to a pattern of fraudulent activity. As I spoke, I watched her face shift from shock to disbelief, then to cold determination. She wasn't just hurt, she was furious. So, she said slowly, her gaze piercing, you want to bring him down for this? She tapped the papers with the tip of her finger. Yes, I replied, holding her stare. Not just for the affair, for everything. I want to see him lose it all. And what about Sarah? She asked, voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. What's your endgame there? I paused, choosing my words carefully. Sarah made her bed. She can lie in it. Once this is over, I want her to feel the consequences of her betrayal. But she's not the target. Mark is. Claire's lips twisted into a bitter smile. Fair enough. She closed the folder and pushed it back to me. I'm in, but I need something from you first. Name it. Her gaze didn't waver. Protection. For my baby. I blinked, the words not quite registering at first. Your baby? She nodded, one hand resting briefly on her stomach. I'm pregnant, about 3 months along. It complicates things. The air left my lungs in a rush. This was a wrinkle I hadn't expected. Does Mark know? No. And he won't, not if I can help it, she said fiercely. I want out, Ethan. After this, I'm done with him. But I need to make sure I have enough to keep my child safe and secure. That's my priority. I stared at her, processing the implications. So what do you want? Money, she said bluntly. I need access to his accounts once this blows up. Enough to get away, start fresh somewhere he can't find us. I nodded slowly, considering. It was a fair ask, and it aligned with what I'd already been planning. Mark's accounts were a treasure trove of illicit activity. I'd have no trouble shifting funds without raising suspicion, at least not until it was too late for him to do anything about it. Okay, I agreed, but we have to do this carefully. Any slip-up, and he'll know something's coming. Understood. She leaned forward, eyes gleaming with an intensity that mirrored my own. How do we start? Refinement of the plan. With Claire on board, things moved quickly. I began gathering more concrete evidence of Mark's activities, using the access I'd gained through Sarah's accounts. Each day brought new revelations, shady offshore transactions, fraudulent tax returns, shell companies used to launder money. Mark had been busy, and he was sloppy. I documented everything, creating a comprehensive file that would be impossible to refute. Claire, for her part, played the role of the dutiful wife to perfection. She kept her distance emotionally, but maintained just enough interaction with Mark to avoid suspicion. She was a natural actress, never letting her mask slip, even as she passed me critical information on his schedule, habits, and the people closest to him. The key was timing. We needed to ensure that when Mark went down, there would be no escape route, no way to recover. We planned meticulously, accounting for every variable. The annual company gala, where Mark would be in the spotlight, surrounded by colleagues and investors, would be the perfect stage for his downfall. But first, I needed more ammunition. Something irrefutable that would not only end his career but destroy his reputation beyond repair. That's when I found it, a series of incriminating emails between Mark and a high-profile client discussing illegal kickbacks and tax evasion schemes. This was the linchpin, the final nail in his coffin. I shared the discovery with Claire during one of our secret meetings at the cafe. Her eyes widened as she read the messages, a slow smile spreading across her face. This is it, she breathed. This will ruin him. It'll do more than that, I said quietly. Once we turn this over to the authorities, he'll be facing prison time. And once he's arrested, his accounts will be frozen. We need to move fast if you want to secure the funds you'll need. Leave that to me. She slipped the pages back into the folder, her expression steely. Just tell me when to act, setting the trap. The days leading up to the gala were a blur of planning and anticipation. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me as everything fell into place. I was no longer the betrayed husband, reeling from the shock of Sarah's infidelity. I was in control. Every move I made was deliberate, every action calculated. I coordinated with Claire to transfer a substantial amount from Mark's accounts into one she controlled, enough to ensure her financial security, but not enough to alert Mark's financial managers. It was a delicate operation, but Claire handled it flawlessly. Mark didn't notice a thing. With the money secured, we turned our focus to the final act, exposing Mark's crimes in front of his peers. I contacted an old college friend who worked for the IRS, tipping him off to the documents I'd gathered. I kept my identity vague, but I made sure he understood the gravity of what I was offering. By the time we hung up, I knew they'd be ready to act. The night of the gala, I arrived early, blending in with the crowd of well-dressed guests. Sarah and I were still putting up the facade of a functional marriage, so we entered together, our smiles masking the tension simmering beneath the surface. Mark was already there, holding court with a group of senior executives, his arm draped possessively over Sarah's shoulder. I watched them from across the room, my heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and anger. Claire slipped in a few minutes later, catching my eye with a brief nod. Everything was in place. I drifted closer to Mark's group, just within earshot, and waited for the signal. When Claire stepped up to Mark, her face composed, I knew it was time. She handed him a glass of champagne, smiling sweetly. "To a night we'll never forget," she murmured. He raised his glass, oblivious. "To success," he agreed, grinning like the smug bastard he was. I gave the slightest nod to the uniformed agents lingering near the entrance, and they moved in. The sudden shift in the atmosphere was palpable. Conversations faltered, eyes turning as the agents approached Mark. "Mr. Davis," one of them said firmly, "we need you to come with us. There are some questions regarding your financial records that require immediate attention." The blood drained from Mark's face. What is this?" he stammered, glancing around as if expecting someone to jump out and yell, "Surprise!" But no one came to his rescue. I watched, heart racing, as they cuffed him, reading his rights in a low, clipped tone. Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. Sarah stood frozen, her face a mask of shock and horror. "Ethan," she whispered, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. "What's happening?" I shrugged, a slow, deliberate smile curling my lips. Guess he wasn't as smart as he thought he was. I turned away, not bothering to watch as Mark was let out, a broken man. My revenge wasn't complete yet, but this was the beginning of their end. For the first time in months, I felt truly alive. I watched Mark being led out of the ballroom, the murmur of disbelief swelling in his wake. The perfect veneer of the gala shattered with every step he took, the guests turning to one another in hushed confusion. I slipped back into the crowd, keeping my face neutral, eyes cold. Sarah's gaze darted around the room, her expression a mixture of panic and shock. She started toward me, but I turned away, deliberately slow. The look of betrayal I glimpsed on her face was almost satisfying, almost. It was too soon to savor the victory. There were still loose ends to tie up. I maneuvered through the throng of whispering guests, the commotion swelling as the news of Mark's arrest spread like wildfire. His CFO, a hawk-eyed man named Leonard, stood by the bar, his lips pressed into a tight line as he watched the spectacle unfold. He seemed on edge, his gaze shifting suspiciously between the door and the remaining executives. Damn it. The last thing I needed was someone getting wise before everything was in place. I straightened my shoulders, slipping into the role of a concerned, confused colleague. I approached him with a furrowed brow, mimicking the confusion that painted the faces around us. "Leonard," I called out, pitching my voice low enough to convey uncertainty. "What the hell is going on? Do you know why they arrested Mark?" Leonard's eyes narrowed slightly, the suspicion in them flickering. No idea, he muttered, his tone clipped. This doesn't make sense. We just had the books audited last quarter. Everything checked out. Unless, he trailed off, his brow furrowing in thought. I leaned in, feigning camaraderie. Unless what? Unless someone fed them bad information, he whispered, the realization dawning in his eyes. Someone wanted Mark gone, but why? I forced a shrug, letting out a low sigh. I don't know, but we can't let this ruin the evening, right? We should keep things moving. The company can't afford any more bad press. Leonard hesitated, his gaze searching mine for any hint of duplicity. But I gave him nothing, just the blank mask of concern. After a beat, he nodded slowly. Yeah, you're right. He drew in a deep breath, straightening his posture. We need to contain this. Exactly. I offered him a tight smile, my eyes scanning the room. Sarah was still lingering near where Mark had been taken away, her hand clenched around her clutch. Claire stood a few feet away, calm and composed, playing her role perfectly. I needed Leonard distracted, so I steered the conversation away from the chaos. Listen, why don't you go make a statement to the press? Just something neutral until we get a better handle on this. I'll help keep things running smoothly here. Leonard hesitated, then nodded, his jaw clenched. I'll handle it. But if you hear anything at all, let me know. Of course. I gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder, watching as he made his way toward the exit. One problem down, a dozen more to go. A sudden realization. As I turned back, scanning the room, Claire caught my eye. She was moving toward me, her face composed but her eyes sharp. We met near one of the quieter corners of the ballroom, where the music and chatter faded into the background. Nice work, she murmured, her voice barely audible over the soft murmur of voices. But Leonard's not the type to let this go easily. I know, I replied tersely. We just need to buy time, long enough for the authorities to lock down Mark's accounts and start digging into the evidence. Once they do, Leonard won't be able to do anything to stop it. Claire nodded, but I could see the tension coiling in her shoulders. And Sarah? My gaze slid over to where Sarah stood, her face pale, her eyes flitting nervously between me and the empty space where Mark had been. She looked lost, like a child who just discovered the world wasn't as safe as she'd thought. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but the memory of her text to Mark, the promises, the lies, choked any sympathy before it could form. I'll deal with her later, I muttered. Right now, she's the least of our concerns. Are you sure? Claire asked quietly, and something in her tone made me pause. I turned to face her fully, brow furrowing. What do you mean? Claire hesitated, then let out a slow breath. She's not as innocent as you think, Ethan. Mark, he wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Sarah knew about the illegal activity. She was in on it, at least part of it. That's how they funded their weekends together. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, struggling to process what she was saying. She knew? All this time? Claire's expression softened, but she didn't look away. Yes, she's been helping him cover up transactions, forging documents. I only found out a few weeks ago. That's why I decided to go through with this. She's just as guilty as he is. A cold rage simmered in my chest, spreading through my veins like ice water. Sarah hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. She'd been complicit in everything. I thought I was getting revenge on Mark, that she'd be a casualty of her own poor choices. But she was no victim. She was an accomplice. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? I hissed, my voice low and furious. Because I knew it would cloud your judgment, Claire said evenly. You wanted to hurt them, Ethan. I needed you focused on Mark, not on punishing Sarah. But now, she trailed off, letting the silence speak for her. I clenched my fists, fighting to keep my composure. The urge to march over to Sarah, to scream at her, to make her pay for everything, surged through me like a tidal wave, but I forced it down. There was a time and place for that confrontation. This wasn't it. Thank you for telling me, I said through gritted teeth. I'll take care of it. Claire reached out, placing a hand on my arm. Just be careful, Ethan. Don't let this ruin you too. I nodded stiffly, not trusting myself to speak. She lingered for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, blending seamlessly into the crowd. Decisive action. I drew in a deep breath, steadying myself. I couldn't afford to let this new information derail the plan. Everything was still in motion, the pieces falling into place exactly as I'd envisioned. But now there was a new wrinkle, one I'd have to deal with sooner rather than later. I moved towards Sarah, my expression carefully controlled. She looked up as I approached, her eyes wide and pleading. "Ethan, what's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did they take Mark? What did you do?" I stared at her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. Then slowly, deliberately, I leaned in. "You really want to know?" I whispered, my lips barely moving. "I had him arrested." "All those fraudulent activities? Tax evasion? It's all out in the open now." She blinked, confusion mingling with fear. But, but how? Why?" "Because, Sarah," I said softly, my voice dripping with venom. "You thought you could play me. You thought you could cheat on me and walk away unscathed. You thought I'd never find out what you were doing with him." Her face drained of color. "Ethan, I don't know what you're talking about. Save it." I cut her off sharply, my tone ice cold. "I know everything. The trips, the hotel rooms, all of it." She took a step back, shaking her head in denial. "No, you don't understand. You were a part of it too, weren't you?" I asked quietly, watching her reaction. "You knew what he was doing. You helped him." She froze, her breath hitching. For a split second, I saw the truth in her eyes, the guilt, the fear. Then just as quickly, she smothered it with a desperate shake of her head. "No, Ethan, I didn't." "Stop lying," I snapped, the words like a whip crack in the air. "I have the documents, the emails, everything. You knew. You were in on it, and now you're going down with him." Sarah's mouth opened and closed, her face crumpling. "Please, Ethan," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. I I was confused. He manipulated me." "Don't," I snarled, the fury burning through my veins. "Don't you dare try to twist this. You made your choice. Now you live with it." I stepped back, letting out a shuddering breath. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. This wasn't how I'd envisioned the night ending, but it didn't matter. The trap was set, the wheels already in motion. Sarah's world would come crashing down around her, just like she'd helped destroy mine. With one last searing look, I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving her standing there, broken and alone. Hours after the gala, I pushed open the front door to our house. No, to my house now, and stepped inside. The familiar scent of jasmine drifted through the air, but tonight it felt cloying, suffocating. Everything looked the same, yet it felt different, hollow. I paused in the entryway, letting the silence wrap around me. Sarah was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. Her makeup was smeared, her hair a mess. The elegant gown she'd worn for Mark, to show off in front of their circle, now hung limply off her shoulders. She looked up as I entered, eyes wide, filled with a mix of fear and confusion. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't respond immediately, just took off my coat and hung it on the rack like it was any other evening. I needed the calm, the measured movements to keep myself in check. Every step felt heavy, laden with the weight of what I was about to do. I turned to face her, my expression unreadable. "We need to talk," I said quietly. She nodded shakily, her lips parting as if to say something, but no words came out. I crossed the room slowly, my gaze never leaving hers, and sat down in the armchair opposite her. The table between us seemed like a chasm, an unbridgeable gap that mirrored the emptiness between us. "Ethan, she began, her voice breaking. "No," I interrupted softly, holding up a hand. "You're going to listen. For once, you're going to hear me out." She fell silent, her eyes filling with unshed tears. I let the silence stretch, watching her struggle. Then I reached into my jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, the same one I'd shown Claire weeks ago. I tossed it onto the table between us. Open it, I instructed. Her hands trembled as she picked up the envelope. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she pulled out the contents. Copies of bank statements, emails, photos. Every lie, every betrayal meticulously documented, laid bare in black and white. I gathered all of this over the last few months, I said, my voice flat. Every hotel receipt, every message you sent him, it's all there, and that's not even the worst of it. She looked up at me, tears spilling down her cheeks. Ethan, please, I can explain. No, you can't. I cut her off, my tone like a blade. You knew what he was doing. You helped him. The money you spent on those weekends away, it wasn't just from your paycheck. It was from his dirty dealings. You forged documents for him. You were part of it, Sarah. She shook her head frantically, as if denying it could somehow erase the truth. No, no, I didn't. I didn't know. Enough! The word exploded out of me, sharp and sudden, making her flinch. I leaned forward, my gaze boring into hers. Don't lie to me, not now. You knew exactly what you were doing. You weren't just cheating on me. You were helping him screw over everyone else too. She crumpled, sobbing into her hands. I was scared, Ethan. He pressured me, said it was the only way. I didn't want to, but save it. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor. You chose this, Sarah. You chose him. You chose to be a part of his schemes, to lie to me, to betray me. Her sobs grew louder, racking her body, but I felt nothing. Just a cold, detached emptiness. I walked over to the fireplace and stared at the framed photos above the mantel. Our wedding picture, vacations, holidays. I reached up and pulled one down, staring at it. Do you remember this? I asked, holding up the photo of us in Italy. You smiled at me like I was your whole world. But I guess even then, you were already slipping away, weren't you? She didn't answer, just buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. I looked at the photo one last time, then dropped it to the floor, watching as the glass shattered. I thought you were my partner, I murmured, almost to myself. My wife, the one person I could trust above all else. But you, Termanen, you're no better than him. The room fell silent except for the sound of her sobs. I turned back to her, feeling the last vestiges of my patience evaporate. Do you know what's going to happen now? I asked coldly. Mark's going to prison. The authorities will dig through every aspect of his life, his accounts, his records, and guess what they'll find? She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. Ethan, please. They'll find you, I said softly. They'll see your name on those documents, the transfers you authorized, the money you spent. You'll be implicated, charged, and by the time they're done, you'll be lucky if you're not sitting in a cell right next to him. Her face crumpled, a broken sob escaping her lips. No, Ethan, please. I'll do anything, just anything. I let out a short, bitter laugh. There's nothing you can do, Sarah. It's too late. She looked up at me, desperation etched across her face. What about us? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Can't we fix this? Can't we? There is no us, I said, my voice hardening. Not anymore. You destroyed that the moment you decided to lie to me. The moment you chose him over us. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, my trump card, the final nail in her coffin. I tossed it onto the table. She stared at it, confusion mingling with dread. What is this? Divorce papers, I said simply. Already signed, effective immediately. And before you think about contesting them, know this. I've frozen every joint account. Your credit cards? Canceled. The money you thought you had? Gone. Her face went slack with shock, the blood draining from her cheeks. You can't. Oh, I can, I replied calmly. Everything you built with him, every cent you thought was yours, was dirty money. And now it's all under investigation. You're left with nothing. She stared at me, horror dawning in her eyes. But what will I do? Where will I go? That's not my problem, I said quietly. You made your choices. Now you live with the consequences. I turned away, my gaze sweeping over the room one last time. The memories, the moments we'd shared here, they meant nothing now. This house, this life we'd built together was just a shell, a hollow facade built on lies and deceit. I'll be gone by tomorrow morning, I said over my shoulder. I suggest you do the same. Because once the authorities come knocking, you won't have much time to pack. She didn't respond, just sat there, a broken shell of the woman I'd once loved. I felt a pang of something. Regret, sorrow, I wasn't sure. But I pushed it down, smothered it with the cold, hard resolve that had carried me this far. Goodbye, Sarah, I said softly, and without another word, I walked out of the room, out of the house, and out of her life. Aftermath, I stood outside, the night air cool against my skin. The silence felt different here, less oppressive, more liberating. I glanced back at the house, the light still on, casting long shadows across the lawn. It was over. Everything I'd planned, everything I'd worked for, done. I should have felt victorious, triumphant, but instead there was only emptiness. A hollow ache where satisfaction should have been. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. The person I'd been before all this, the trusting, naive husband, that man was gone. And in his place was, what exactly? A man capable of destroying everything, of tearing down the lives of those who betrayed him. A man I barely recognized. I opened my eyes and turned away from the house, walking toward my car. The engine roared to life, and I pulled out of the driveway, the tires crunching softly against the gravel. As I drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror one last time. The house grew smaller, fading into the distance, until it was nothing more than a shadow against the night sky. A chapter had closed, but the book was far from finished. I didn't know where I was headed, but for the first time in a long while, I felt free. Free from the lies, the deceit, the anger that had consumed me. Free to start over, whatever that looked like. In the days that followed, I found myself in an unfamiliar landscape, one where revenge no longer fueled my every thought. For the first time in months, I woke up without the heavy knot of anger and betrayal twisting in my gut. Instead, I felt a strange, numbing emptiness. The satisfaction I'd expected to feel after watching Sarah's world crumble never fully arrived. It was like tasting ash when I had been expecting something sweet. I spent those early mornings at the beach, the waves crashing against the shore, drowning out the thoughts that threatened to consume me. The roar of the ocean was a welcome companion, relentless and chaotic, much like my own emotions. I stood there staring out at the horizon, wondering what came next. I had no job, no wife, no obligations. My life had been a carefully structured plan, each move a step closer to this grand moment of retribution. And now, with the climax reached, the aftermath was mine to navigate. I'd won. I'd shattered the illusion of the life Sarah and Mark had built. But in doing so, I'd also broken a part of myself that I wasn't sure I could ever piece back together. Claire called the day after Sarah's breakdown. I was holed up in a small motel by the highway trying to decide what my next move should be. Her name flashing on my phone screen surprised me. I hadn't expected her to reach out so soon, if at all. Ethan, she said softly, her voice steady despite everything that had happened. I just wanted to see how you're holding up. I let out a dry laugh, the sound echoing in the empty room. I'm existing, not much more than that. A pause, then, can we meet? I hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was late, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to see her. But something in her voice, something fragile yet determined, made me agree. Yeah, where? We met at a small coffee shop a few miles outside of town. It was nearly deserted, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the empty booths. Claire sat by the window, staring out at the darkened street. She looked different, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. But there was a tightness around her eyes, a lingering sadness that I recognized all too well. Thanks for coming, she said as I slid into the seat across from her. I nodded, wrapping my hands around the steaming cup of coffee she'd ordered for me. The silence between us stretched, comfortable yet charged with unspoken words. It was Claire who broke it first. "Mark's been denied bail," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the swirling patterns in her own cup. "The evidence? It's damning. They're building a strong case against him." I nodded, unsurprised. "And Sarah?" A shadow flickered across her face. "She's struggling. She tried calling me yesterday, but I didn't pick up. I don't want to get dragged into her mess, not after everything." I understood her reluctance. Sarah had been more than a mistress to Mark. She'd been complicit, helping him cover his tracks. Claire had every reason to keep her distance. "She'll be all right," I murmured, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. "She's resourceful. She'll figure something out." Claire studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "And what about you, Ethan? What will you do now?" I glanced out the window, the distant hum of traffic, a dull backdrop to my thoughts. "I don't know," I admitted. "I thought I'd feel closure or something, but all I feel is empty." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing against mine. "You did what you had to do. You put an end to their lives, but that kind of destruction, it leaves scars on both of us." The sincerity in her gaze startled me. I hadn't considered how deeply this had affected her. Claire was just as much a victim as I was, betrayed by a man she'd once trusted, forced to tear down the life she'd built to protect her unborn child. "What about you?" I asked softly. "What's next for you and the baby?" She gave a small, rueful smile. "I'm not sure. I have some money set aside, and with Mark's accounts frozen, there's no way for him to come after me. I'll move somewhere quiet, start over, give my child a chance at a normal life." A normal life, the words tasted bittersweet. I wasn't sure what normal looked like anymore. But watching Claire, seeing her strength and resolve, I realized that maybe there was still hope. Maybe we could both find something resembling normalcy again. "Wherever you end up," I said quietly, "I hope it brings you peace." She nodded, her eyes softening. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." I couldn't have done this alone. Neither could I realized. Without her support, without her sharing the burden of revenge, I might have lost myself completely. Claire had been my anchor through the storm, and for that, I owed her more than I could ever repay. As we sat there, the night stretching on around us, I felt a flicker of something. Something tentative, fragile, like the first rays of dawn breaking through the darkness. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was hope. A sense that maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild from the wreckage of what I'd become. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet reflection and tentative new beginnings. I rented a small apartment on the other side of town, far away from the memories of my old life. I found a job, something simple and unassuming, a fresh start. Each day was a battle to redefine myself, to figure out who I was now that the rage had burned itself out. Claire and I stayed in touch. She moved to a small coastal town, a place where she could raise her child in peace. Our conversations were infrequent, but comforting. There was no romantic spark between us, just a deep, unspoken understanding of what we'd survived together. One afternoon, as I unpacked the last of my boxes, I stumbled across an old photo album, pictures of Sarah and me, taken back when I'd believed in us, in our future. My first instinct was to throw it away, to rid myself of any reminder of what she'd done, but I hesitated, the album heavy in my hands. Instead, I sat down and flipped through the pages, letting the memories wash over me. There were happy moments, genuine smiles. For a time, we'd been good together. And even if it had all ended in betrayal, those moments had still existed. I couldn't erase them, just as I couldn't erase the man I'd been, the man who trusted and loved so deeply. The scars were there, yes, but they were a part of me, just as much as the vengeance and the destruction. I couldn't run from them, couldn't pretend they didn't exist. What I could do was accept them, learn from them, and move forward. With a deep breath, I closed the album and set it aside. I wasn't that man anymore, but I wasn't entirely lost either. There was a path ahead of me, uncertain and uncharted, and for the first time, I was ready to take it. Months passed. The trial against Mark began, and I kept tabs on it from a distance. He'd been indicted on multiple counts of fraud and tax evasion. Sarah was dragged into the mess as expected, and though I felt a pang of pity, it was tempered by the knowledge that she'd chosen her fate. I kept my focus on the future, on building something new from the ashes of my old life. I took up running again, pounding the pavement in the early morning hours, letting the physical exertion clear my mind. I read more, lost myself in books, rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. One evening, as I watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, I realized I'd found something I hadn't thought possible: peace. It was a hard-won peace, fragile but real. I knew the scars of betrayal would always be there, lingering just beneath the surface. But they no longer defined me. I was more than my revenge, more than my anger. I was someone who had survived, who had come through the fire and emerged stronger. Claire and I spoke one last time before she moved overseas. Her voice was lighter, filled with a cautious optimism that mirrored my own. She was ready to begin her new life, and so was I. We wished each other well, no promises of staying in touch, just a mutual respect, a silent understanding that we'd helped each other heal in our own way. As I hung up, a sense of finality settled over me. It wasn't an ending, it was a new beginning. One that I was finally ready to embrace. Standing on my balcony, the night air cool against my skin, I looked out at the city that had once felt like a prison. Now it was full of possibility. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it, stronger, wiser, and more at peace with myself than I'd ever been. The past was a closed chapter, the pain of betrayal a lesson learned. And now it was time to move forward, toward a future I could shape with my own hands.